All right. Okay, and I'm just gonna go live on Facebook, so give me 1 minute. So yeah, to begin off, I will introduce a few of the people here. So we have Cease Wyss, who is Maplewood Flats resident ethnobotanist, Indigenous plant diva, which is my favorite name, and a member of Squamish Nation, as well as has Stolo and Swiss ancestry. So thank you so much, Cease, for being here. We also have Kristen Miskelly, who is the owner and founder of Saanich Native Plants. So huge thank you for her for attending today. We really appreciate that. And Erin Kendall, who is the project manager for our nursery here at Maplewood Flats. So thank you to all of them for being here and attending. And yeah, and so I'll pass it off to Erin. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. We also have some additional familiar faces in the group, a couple of nursery volunteers and nursery connected folks. So that's great to see you on the call as well. I wanted to just introduce briefly sort of the format for our workshop, let's call it, or our panel this evening, which is that we'll start by delivering about 15 minutes or so of content around considerations for timing of planting native plants and sowing seeds, because so often people are focused on the spring and summer planting window and then aren't thinking about the fall, which is of course a great time to be working with native plants also. So we're here to walk you through some of those considerations. And then we'll move into a question and answer kind of format. Was inspired by the CBC's call-in show with Brian Minter, where you can just kind of ask anything and everything, and we'll do our best to answer from across our various, our various realms of knowledge. So to start, I was going to invite Cease to share any comments or teachings that she was compelled to share around planting and seeding. So I'll pass it to her.
Almost forgot to unmute, sorry. Like, I've been on Zooms a lot today. So half of it I was not allowed to touch the button. That's why I almost forgot to do that. Yeah, so I was actually in between that last Zoom and this. I went and did a little consultation at a little elementary school. So I was looking at the earth and seeing outside what's going on. And yeah, it's a little cold because we just had some snow. So if you're going to be starting things, it's best to try to start things inside or maybe on a balcony or something that's not going to get like frost directly on it, or, so the cold isn't terrible for things at this time of year, because if you're going to be growing indigenous plants, they're already used to this cold. That's what they love. They, you can freeze them seeds and take them out and put them in the ground and they're still going to grow. But they do need some essential nutrients. Like we all need things that feed us. So a seed is something that is like, it's no different in a way than a baby, other than you get to throw it in the ground and pour water on it, which you would never do to a child. But to our baby seedlings, we put them into the earth and we make sure they have dark humus soil. Always read directions if you have a packet to see if they go on the surface or if they go a certain depth, maybe this much, maybe this much. It's always really important to, to get seeds, indigenous seeds, either from people that can give you direct sowing information, or if you do like me and you go to the UBC Botanical Gardens or Van Dusen, and I buy seeds because they have all the directions for each plant. And that was how I started to learn about how to, follow the depths and things. Sometimes they'll even tell you to freeze them and grow them at a different time of year. So that's all really important. For the ones you're able to grow now, start with the good soil mix, get the proper depth, And when you get everything done, it doesn't really hurt to put some kind of mulch. So you could even go into your yard and get some alder leaves or maple leaves that are decomposing and just put that on as a little blanket. And if you have access to wood chips, like I was joking at this consultation and the ladies laughed because I said, yeah, when we need wood chips in our community, we go visit the carvers, right? So we can, because they mostly carve in cedar, I only get that for the red huckleberry. So if you're growing red huckleberry, you definitely need cedar shavings and cedar boughs and any part of the cedar to feed the soil. So it's also important to do a little bit of research and looking at the environment these plants grow in and what the ground looks like. Decomposing vegetative matter is very, very good for little seedlings. It's like a vitamin and mineral for us. So following those things, it really helps us to imagine how to care for these little seedlings. And then making sure to water it regularly, but not overwater it. And so, again, you can touch parts of the surface to see if it's dry. And if it's well drained, if it's in a pot, you start with some rocks, you fill up some soil, you put your seeds or seedlings and your seeds in, and then you add like the vegetative matter. And if you can, for most plants like salmonberry and other things, you'd want to use alder chips and alder sawdust and stuff, or maple. And for red huckleberries, you want to, those are all important things. And I think that's about it. I'm going to pass it on to the next person. I hope that's helpful and made sense.
Awesome. Thanks, Cease. So let's start with planting considerations we'll start with the plants and then follow up with the seeds. For plants, we find ourselves here at the late winter, early spring. And for those of us on the South Coast, at least, we're within striking distance of our last frost dates, which are generally landing by the last week or two in March is when we can sort of typically expect the last frost. And if you're buying any bigger potted plants at this time, it's a fine time to just be getting them out there and get them in the ground now. And as Cease was just saying, you can do the same, support them with some mulch to protect against any, frost that's going to come between now and the end of March. But getting them in the ground now is going to give their roots a chance to, albeit slowly, start getting themselves arranged in their new home. Kristen has some great materials that they've put together for pot planting considerations. And I wonder, Kristen, if you want to pipe up at this point or share some of that material.
Sure, I'll do a quick screen share here just to show you a couple of the materials. Sorry, just one sec here. I thought I had it open.
Just let me know if you need help. I did make you co-host though.
I'm not sure where it went. I'm so sorry. I have.
Oh, we got it.
So this is a handout through the nursery that's just called Planting from Pots. And it's just some general information about preparing for planting, things about root care, planting depth. These are general tips. So this isn't supposed to be specific for every kind of plant. It's meant to be more of a guideline to just help in a general way. And we also have a similar handout for seeding that you can find online at our website as well. So at the bottom right there is our web address. And then if you went to the resources page, you'd be able to find these handouts.
Awesome. Do you have any spring specific considerations, Kristen, that stand out for you as far as, or plants that love to be, native plants that love to go in the ground at this time versus the fall or even summer, for instance?
Yeah, you mean specifically from pot rather than from seed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right now, it's really important with all the plants that have underground storage, like to a bulb or a corm or any kind of underground storage that a plant might be doing. And when they flower, many of those flower early in the spring. So camas is a good example of that. And native onions are another example, or chocolate lilies. And because they flower so early, they do quite a bit of growing in the winter. And when you have an opportunity to pot them early, you really make the most of that plant for the season and have an opportunity to have it in the ground before it's doing more of its above ground growth and going to flower. And it doesn't mean that you can't pot those kinds of plants at various times of year. You can, but it's just that this time of year when it's relatively warm and moist and cool, it's such a great opportunity to be disturbing the roots and that sort of thing without setting the plant back, and also enjoying the spring blooms from the plants.
Cease and I were also discussing at the site at Tsleil-Waututh's administration building, where we've got a project soon to be underway, just the specific microsite things that can happen in spring, where if you're planting next to any concrete or asphalt, then the heat radiation from what feels like a relatively mild spring day can be projecting quite a bit of heat on those sites. So although it might feel kind of relatively cool to us, it's already can be quite warm for the plants. So those of us who have urban gardens along sidewalks or driveways and like that we have these microclimates to consider also, so that it's warming up sooner in those types of areas than others.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to move through the seasons. If we cast forward to planting in summer, one of the things that we love, of course, about considering planting native plants is that they have a much reduced need for attention and maintenance and watering ultimately once they're established. But wanted to just point out that we generally encourage people to, if you're planting in summer in the hotter months, that a lot of the plants, most of them really will want some amount of watering support if you aren't getting the rainfall, that at least their first season of growing in your garden, that you're providing that support, and can of course again be adding some mulch to help keep whatever moisture you've got in the ground. And again, I'll invite either Cease or Kristen to pipe in with a summer consideration before we move on to fall.
Cease, would you like to say anything there?
I keep turning that off because there's yeah, sorry. I don't know if I can add any more to that. So I'll just, if you have anything, go ahead.
Sure, I would just reiterate to an extent what Erin had said there about, of course, conditions are so much different in the summer than they are in the early spring. And to be mindful of that, particularly if there's any kind of root disturbance in transplanting pots. And some plants can be more fragile than others. There are certainly a whole suite of species that are very quite vigorous and tolerant of disturbance. Yarrow would be a really good example of that. It's a plant that's difficult to set back and really is so tolerant, and you can do so much with it over the course of the year. While you might not want to be teasing apart the roots of a more fragile species and worrying that you're actually harming the plant. So just being careful about moving things around at that time of year. And if you are moving things around in the summer, like Erin had said, to plan on doing some supplemental watering. So the same plants that you might plant in the early spring and not need to water for the entire season, and that can even include shrubs or other perennial wildflowers from pot, planting those same species in the summer, you should expect to need to water them because their leaves are out, they're transpiring, so they're losing water from their leaves. And often in a pot, the root zone has been restricted compared to the above ground growth. So in the ground, a plant that's all leafed out, as you would see in a pot, would normally have a much larger root system in the ground and be able to compensate for that plant transpiring. So all the water it's losing, it would be sucking up. But if a freshly transplanted pot or plant has been put in the ground, it doesn't have the root development yet to be able to do that and compensate for the water loss. So you want to add that water and keep all the tissues of the plant nice and cool and healthy. And I think unless anyone else has something to mention about the summer planting, I think that's about it that I can think of for now.
Yeah, just mostly that I don't do a lot of transplanting in the summer. That's all, because unless it was like a summer like last year where everything's cool, but it's just to say that plants are most vulnerable in the heat. And so if you're gonna do it either super early in the morning or late in the evening so that the heat doesn't kill, and it will still go into shock and you'll still have to nurture it. And that's about it.
So Kristen was mentioning the disproportionate volume of above ground growth to root growth, and that's a good segue into fall planting, because this is of course when the plants, many of them are going dormant and starting to transfer that energy into the roots, and those roots will start their slow growth and restocking for winter. So although people's planting enthusiasm and focus seems to really fall off a cliff in the fall, one thing that we're all about with the organization, and which the nurseries like Kristen's are necessarily all about, is this educational component about the life of plants and how to support them best. And so we wanted to just highlight the fall being a great time to actually start thinking about getting plants in the ground. The weather is cooled, the stresses aren't quite as much on the plants, and they have a chance to really establish themselves through the winter time. And it also is a segue for us into the topic of seeding, because if you think of your natural seed cycles with our local plants, they're going to seed towards the end of summer, and those seeds are beginning to set out in the late summer and early fall. So this is gets to be an interesting and exciting time actually for people gardening with native plants. Do either of you want to pipe in?
Sure, I'll just say something ahead of Cease here before you're ready, Cease, unless you want to come in now. So fall, when I hear fall, I just think about planting and seeding. For us, that's certainly the major seeding time. We sow the majority of the plants that we sow at that time of year. We do sow a sweet again in early spring, but there's what is called cold stratification. And there's a suite of native plants that require a period of time of fluctuating warmth and cold, as well as alternating moisture. And this can vary between species, but ultimately what it does is it triggers germination in the plants. And it's an adaptation of plants to germinate when the conditions are optimal. And for different species, that's different. So for a plant like, I'll bring up camas again, but sowing camas in the fall, you must sow it in the fall, but it doesn't germinate until spring. So it will stay and requires that cold and wet and those cycles to trigger it to germinate. And then there are other species where you sow them in the fall and they'll germinate when you sow them, just days after, even 3 days after. And our native annuals like sea blush and miner's lettuce are good examples of that kind of plant, and they germinate in the fall. And still there's a whole other group of plants that you can sow them in the early spring, like now, and they'll germinate then as well. And like Cease had said, how some of her passion for native plants, reading those instructions for all those requirements on seed packages, working with native seeds is such a powerful way to learn about plants and learn about the life history of plants and those special requirements. And there's just so many lessons about ecology of your area embedded into that. They all tell a story of why do they want to be sown then? Why do they sprout then? And all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and like both Erin and Kristen have talked about is, like when you're following the seasons, it does come from it stems from your research of these plants and observations in nature. And, you can start any time to observe. You don't have to say, oh, I missed everything, because there's always a new season. There's always the next season. And if you don't feel comfortable enough to start, then it's good to start walking in the forest and looking at what's growing, taking photos of things, and researching what plants are coming up at certain times of year. And the fall, most people understand that when they're growing garlic, they have to do that in the fall, late summer, fall, early winter, before the ground freezes. So it's something people know that, but they don't understand with other plants that are bulb-based plants, that they also follow that kind of trajectory. So things like any tuberous plants like that, you would want to get in the ground in the fall, and camas is definitely one of them. And so is wapato. You can, if you have a pond and you want to grow some wapato, then start getting it in. Start those in the late fall, or late summer, early fall, so they start to get established, so that next year they're just coming up on their own. And every plant, like I was saying, even about huckleberry, I would actually be seeding huckleberry in the fall, red huckleberry, not in the spring, because it won't survive well. And so again, it's following the seasons, thinking about how nature would be nurturing the life cycle of those plants. And when they go to seed, again, sometimes you have to take a year to just walk through and look and understand that process, to understand when you start planting things. So every season has its joys and its trials and tribulations, so it's all about aligning it with the proper season and looking at what you grow. It's like anything that we grow, even when you look at a West Coast seeds chart, it's going to tell you what to start. Some things you're like, wait a minute, I start broccoli in the fall, what? But it grows the best in the coldest weather, as long as it's protected from frost and extreme cold. Then, so you wouldn't want to put it, like if you had a greenhouse, it'd be great to grow it in there all winter. Or if you had a balcony or deck, it's hidden, you could grow it from the fall to winter. So, but you can also start in February or March. And so that way, by the time it comes to fruition, it grows. But that's with produce. When you're looking at Indigenous plants, camas, especially one of them, you do want to follow its life cycle of when it's going to be coming out. And it will properly flourish in the spring into summer, and then it goes to seed, and then those seeds drop, and you know, the bulbs start to grow and sometimes create new babies. So there's different ways that these plants propagate themselves and how we encourage them. But I don't want to take up all.
Thank you, Cease. We had advertised with the event that we would address some of the seeds that we sold through Wild Bird Trust this winter, and there was a pollinator mix as well as the self-heal seeds, and we will, so I want to just acknowledge we'll come back to the question of those seeds and that sowing timing specifically, as well as mentioning some that can get planted out post frost as we move into spring. But in the meantime, there's a couple of questions that have landed now in the chat. And so let's move to taking some of those. People are welcome to put a question into the chat in that way, or if you prefer, you can go down on the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a smiley face that says reactions, and click on there, and you can choose to raise your hand. And Nicole will spot you and pipe up that you're there with a question. I'll read out Tommy and Paige's first question in the mix here, which is that they say, I have a pot of camas on my deck, wondering about frost and freezing temps on bulbs in pots on a balcony. Should I protect it at any point? We haven't worked out exactly how we're going to take the responses for the questions.
I can respond a bit about that. I want to give a couple of pieces of advice about camas, because a lot of people don't actually think about how the natural ecosystem of camas, and they have companion plants. They have friends that really help them, and one of them, believe it or not, is buttercup. So if you have buttercup, I would actually, if you have your camas in pots, I would actually dig up some buttercup and put it into your pot with your camas, because the roots of the buttercup are going to help protect the camas bulbs, but they're also going to create mulch in the winter time that protects it. So if you don't have any of that, then a good thing to do right now is to put some leaf mulch on it to keep it from freezing too far down. Another plant that camas loves to grow with is Gary oak. So you could also get a little potted Gary oak plant and try to have them all three in the same environment, growing environment, the earth, so that the roots start to touch each other, because that is how they love to grow together. And you know, if we were to go back in time, we would find that in a natural setting. Well, the local buttercup is the one I just saw. Christine asked about that. So local ranunculus, I'm probably saying it wrong, but the most common buttercup that you see around that grows everywhere in the, yes, thank you, ranunculus occidentis. Giving my mouth a good workout with all the Latin words, but all three of them love each other. They go together like corned beans and squash. They really do support each other. And when thinking about Indigenous plants, think about the whole idea of plant guilds, and what it's not just about wanting to grow, oh, I want to grow this, I want to grow red huckleberry. Well, you need cedar. So if you want to grow camas, you also need to include Gary oak and buttercup. And on that note, if you're growing it in a container, it's fine. But if you have a yard where you're like, I can't get rid of this buttercup, then start growing camas in there, because your camas will thrive and it will expand and it will grow to your heart's content. So, so that's just a good thing to consider, is that plants are all about ecosystems. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Okay.
Just if who's not seeing the chat, I would highlight just to make sure that Kristen provided the name of the Latin name for the native buttercup. If you're looking for it, it's Ranunculus occidentalis, and to be really mindful that you're not getting a hold of the European varietal, which has a much larger leaf, bigger plant overall, and is poisonous to livestock and takes over everything. So that's include. The next question posed was from Christine, and she says she's interested in connecting nature appreciation, propagation, collecting cuttings, I think is what you mean by stakes, collecting stakes, collecting seed, making more explicit the cyclic processes of propagation, and understanding how to engage and facilitate in a respectful way. So this is an interesting question and topic. We see lots of guidance from different native plant organizations and proponents in the Pacific Northwest anywhere around explicitly not collecting wild seed, and then we don't have an official statement on that from Wild Bird Trust at this point, and obviously there are growing sites and ways to go about that can be done without it being a damaging footprint. So thanks for that question. It's a good one. Especially seed collection become more and more popular. It's definitely something that we need to be considering. Cease, do you want to take a run at this first? Do you have a position?
No, you guys go. I like to kind of absorb it in my brain and think of how I'm going to say it. So you two go ahead. Or Kristen.
Sure. I would just point, I think that starting to ask questions like that is so important, and that I think there's a division that needs to be made between non-Indigenous settlers and relationships to land and harvesting from land versus Indigenous peoples with inherent harvesting rights. And so I'll speak to the settler non-Indigenous harvesting, where I think that needs to be done with considerable caution, particularly in ecosystems that are already under threat, and to think about some of the things we're talking about here in terms of propagation, and how to instead of in some cases where you might be taking things, to be putting them back where you can. So maybe that's a community garden or a planter box or a larger parcel on your own property or something like that, or helping out at a restoration project. I think there's species that are less harmed by collection. So Christine makes some excellent points here about those connections to the cyclical processes in nature, and how she mentioned stakes here. So often those woody species of shrubs, so collecting some fruit off of shrubs is a good example of something that often has very little impact, while you wouldn't go out and dig up camas bulbs as a non-Indigenous person and be potentially taking away those harvesting sites for community members of these treasured, very important cultural plants. So I think each plant, each ecosystem, each approach always needs to be evaluated very carefully. And if there's any question, to just do your best to grow those species or enhance the populations, and even then be careful, being cognizant of what you're harvesting and thinking about what wildlife are using those, and maybe I'll take a small amount, those kinds of considerations.
I would also pipe in that for those of us near to any urban or developing rural areas, often there's sort of unlimited access to sites that are being developed or slated for development. And so there's an opportunity where you can go and collect seed, take some cuttings, or even in the case where they're going to be excavating, you could dig up some plants in those contexts without degrading land that's going to be left to grow. And we have an example of that having taken place recently here at Maplewood Flats. The District of North Vancouver are developing a fire hall site across the road, and there was an opportunity to salvage a bunch of sword fern from that site, which were otherwise going to end up just composted in a pile. So those plants got rescued and brought over across the road. But yeah, you could always be in touch with your municipality. You're just keeping an eye to where the development signs are to take some of those opportunities also.
Yeah, and so I agree with all of that. That's part of how I do things when I want to transplant things. I again think about the season, and I think about, you know, if I'm moving plants in the summer, I'm risking that they're not going to survive, because the reality is the heat. It doesn't matter how much you protect it; it can still go into immense shock. And but if you're wanting to propagate from other plants, I mean, one of the fun things about the pruning season that's coming up is that if people are wanting to, you know, say you don't have say you want to have some red flowering currant in your yard, and you know of a bush that is maybe getting a little out of hand, then you could go with your pruners and prune a couple of pieces. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can also prune some willow and put it all into a bucket with some cold water and leave it outside. And the willow has a growth hormone that'll help it root quicker, so it can do that. But also at this time of year and up until April, mid to late April, where it starts to get much warmer, you can actually just take your pruned bits of red flowering currant and put it right into the ground, and it will start to root. So there are a lot of things that start to root on their own, and red willow does this, and red flowering currant and regular willow. But again, like I said, you can put them in with white or yellow willow. I definitely say don't try to do it with red willow, because red willow is technically not a willow, it's a dogwood. So it may not have, I don't know, I haven't studied it to see if it has the rooting hormone, but definitely true willows do. And yeah, and Kristen has written some stuff in there, so check out her notes. And so those are, you know, some of the easier ways of doing that. If you're doing like berry plants, they're going to be a lot more delicate and a lot harder. Sorry, I'll read that. Explain how to cut the red currant. Oh, like you just say, this is the red currant branch, and I take a pair of scissors or pruning and I cut it on an angle. Then that's how you cut it. I don't know how else to explain that, but that's what I had just said, was using a pruning shear and you cut it on an angle. So it's like a little spear. And that way it gives the opportunity for it to kind of grow around. And literally last spring, I was walking through the forest just south of Welsh Street, and I saw this little red elderberry plant that had been knocked over, and the way that it had been knocked over, it started rooting, and it was on a trail that had been blown around, and I knew it was going to die if I left it there. So I brought it back to Harmony Garden, and because it was on a U-shaped angle where the root was, so part of it had nothing, part of it had a little branch fighting to survive. And I brought it back to Harmony Garden, put it in the soil just enough with a rock at the U-shaped part, and then I packed earth around it, and I just kept an eye on it, and rained a lot, so I didn't have to water it. But yeah, I think that these, am I right, Kirsten, that these are all being propagated? So you've just taken these little stems and put them into the ground in these little seed trays, and they're starting to root. Is that right?
Yeah, it's red flowering currant.
There you go.
And
see?
Just like Cease said, the process for taking cuttings is just a piece of magic, and in some ways really is as simple as cutting. You heard her mention on a diagonal, and you see that right here. Mm-hmm. One thing you'll notice where all these cuts are can you see where the bud is attached? So the bud for the upper cut, I like to do them where the first bud is right below that cut without nicking it.
Yeah.
And then in the bottom cut, I do it the opposite way around. So, and then you keep them pointed with the growth facing up, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to mention, but you
No,
can
that's
plant them
good.
upside down, if that makes sense, and then
Yeah.
it won't work. And I
Yeah.
have done that. And that, the guy, when I first started doing cuttings, I did that. And someone pointed that out to me. And you can see, just looking at the texture of the soil, I like to lighten the soil up when those first fibrous roots start to form at the bud that is below the soil. I want to give them an easy time. I don't want them to have a bunch of obstructions. So we lighten up the soil quite a bit. And these buds, so can you guys see the cursor when I have it here?
I can. Can
So
others?
What'd you say, Cease?
Oh, I was just saying I can. I hope others can. I mean, it's
I
really
see some thumbs. That's good.
Yeah.
So here's a node, here's a node, here's a node, and so on. And you always want to make sure there's at least one node below the soil. And for some species, that's where the root originates. And for some plants, like Cease had mentioned, willows and red willow or red osier dogwood, those can actually root just adventitiously along the whole stem that is below ground, because they're full of a hormone that is meant for rooting, and they're just very that's what they're adapted to do. And part of that is like them being wetland species and used to that inundation of water, and then that's part of their propagation tool, while these red flowering currants are less so in that way, but still make for wonderful cuttings. And you can do them at a variety of times a year. Am I rambling on too much if I just quickly mention different types of cuttings
No, I think it's good. I can jump in if I think of anything.
Okay, good.
But go ahead. I think that's great.
Okay. Cuttings can be thought of, and this is very general, but in three ways. There's hardwood, semi-hardwood, and softwood. And softwood is that spring wood that's very friable and brand new. Semi-hardwood is the previous season's growth, so it's still quite bendable, but it has started to thicken. And then hardwood is an older season's growth. Most of the time when we do cuttings, we do semi-hardwood. So it's not the freshest of the fresh, but it's the previous seasons. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I really like doing kind of winter cuttings, and you don't have to worry about them as much. They don't get too warm, and they just do their rooting out kind of into the late winter and then put on growth in the spring. But there's lots of ways to do things, and I've just started to learn about propagating in this way the past few years, and I feel new to it and so much to learn that as far as I feel just like a novice with it, with cutting so far.
Kristen, there's a question from Christine as to whether or not you use rooting hormone or not with your cuttings.
So we're on an organic farm, and in the past haven't used rooting hormone, but we've started to propagate some things away from the farm. And this season we're trying some rooting hormone on some different kinds of cuttings. So we're going to try some hormone with hairy manzanitas and kinnikinnick, and there was another, I can't remember what the other species was that we did, but we are going to try using some rooting hormone. You can too, and Cease, maybe you want to talk about this as well, but where you can cut up willows, like chop them up and make a broth and steep them. Like I don't do it with warm water. I just do it in cold water. You let it sit overnight, and then you can put the ends of your cuttings in that. And that hormone that triggers the rooting in willow translates into the other plants and can actually serve as a rooting hormone when the other cuttings have sat in it.
Yeah, that's what we do in Harmony Garden. We just, like when we're pruning, then we put them all in a bucket and they hang out together and do their thing, you know. Then you can pull them out and spread them out around the garden. And so, I mean, we do a couple of things with our red willow, because there are some spiritualists that ask us to put it aside and we give it to them for their ceremonial use. But the ones that, you know, we find really long ones and we think would make really good young trees, then we will put them in the bucket with the yellow willow that we have on the site, because it's consistently growing more and more branches every time we prune it. It's like, okay, but I'm gonna go to a willow weaving, live willow weaving fence making workshop, so I can learn how to control that yellow willow in another way and make it. But I'm using that same thing where I'll put the tops down and kind of, you know, swoop them with a rock so that the branch here can get some roots and then keep going and just kind of follow that. So all kinds of willow except the red willow, because it's red osier, which is dogwood. So yeah, so white willow, black willow, yellow willow, gray willow, weeping willow. they all have they all have the rooting hormone. And if you're not sure about it, then always, you know, look up the Latin name and make sure that it is a true willow. So Salix, yeah, Booker's willow, yeah, Sitka willow. So all of those do have the rooting hormones if they're a true willow. So yeah, good questions.
Since we're on a live staking tangent here, I thought I should give a nod to our restoration component of our mandate and mention too that if you happen to have a source of willow, or the red osier dogwood also works well for this, that's appropriate to harvest, and you have a site where you've got maybe some erosion issues, or you're interested in securing the slope in any way, those live cuttings that you can take in the same way as what Kristen and Cease have been describing, you can take those same cuttings and just lay them actually on the ground, cover them lightly, and they'll do that same rooting magic and send up shoots and work as a live retention system for the area where you put them, and with the caveat that they'll need moisture, pretty steady moisture, to stay happy and alive in that state initially. But that's something that gets used often in ecological restoration to create structures. You can do circle drains or weave the stakes to help stabilize slopes. So that's fun to experiment with also if you're interested in covering a larger area rather than one plant at a time. You can try it with stakes and get them to root out in that way. We have another question. I'm just conscious we're coming up within striking distance of our end time of 8 o'clock, and we haven't addressed the seeds. That we can run over time or agree to send around publish some more information on them. But I want to take Elena's question and invite anyone else who's got others to get them in the chat or throw your hand up in the next minutes, so we don't overlook your curiosities. Elena's saying she's originally from Alberta and has encountered people selling native seeds for Alberta, but discovering that the seeds she purchased weren't exactly native to her region, i.e. won't survive in the temperature range she lives in or are considered a pest in her area. How can she check that what she has is best for her region? So I can address this only by saying that there seems to be that each organization or entity that we encounter seems to have a different sort of line in the sand about what to include or not to include in calling things a native seed mix or pollinator mix. And it's a bit tedious to have. You can always check with them directly to see if they've stuck with what their parameters were for deciding, or the more involved process would actually be to look at each species that's included In the case of the pollinator mixes that we did here, and the plants that we're carrying in the nursery, for the most part, we're sticking with plants that are at least native to BC and particularly thriving in the South Coast in this bioregion. With our pollinator mix, we included some that are hardy to colder zones, but that were interesting from an aesthetic point of view, or for pollinators, like the Rocky Mountain bee plant. By its name, you can tell it's not a coastal plant, but it will grow here and support the pollinators here without becoming a problem plant. So that's for Wild Bird Trust's part, how we're approaching. I will note that with climate change, we have all kinds of adaptation concerns also coming in. So I know lots of people are turning their attention to plants from neighboring bioregions, so to Washington or to Oregon and even to California, as plants like our red cedars start to get intensely stressed out by the summers that we're having. Then it's their cousins, the incense cedars, the California redwoods, that are maybe going to become, extending their ranges to the north. And that same logic can apply to the forbs and the shrubs too, that we might start seeing shifts in the plants that are becoming adapted here, and that those changes are coming to a certain extent. So that can also be part of the reason why people include plants outside the region where they're targeting.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, like, for cedars, it's also again about giving them support and planting a couple of big leaf maple near them that create shade, and they grow faster than the cedar, and red huckleberry to help them as well, because red huckleberry and cedar love to grow together. And on the subject of vacciniums, like the blueberries you're talking about, they do get moved around to grow in different zones. But the interesting thing is that all vacciniums grow very slowly. It doesn't matter. They might grow faster than they normally do in different conditions, but they are still low growing. So here's my arm. It's about the same length as most people's. That's about a 10 to 12 year growth of red huckleberry and blueberry, common blueberry. So it gives you an idea, like they grow very slowly. Even the high mountain huckleberry that we have outside the nature house, it's a lot older than most people think. It's like very slow growing, and all of these vacciniums grow slowly. So kind of the trick to supporting your conifers is to grow deciduous trees that are natural, alder and maple, to help provide a bit of shade and protection, and to give them more root support as well. So it's, a lot of people just want to go and put one cedar somewhere in the middle of some hot zone, and you're setting it up to fail. It will never reach its 1,600-year-old mark. Not that we could check on that, because none of us are going to live that long, but our future ancestors will. So if you're trying to plant legacy trees, like you really want to nurture them and give them that support. Again, it's about looking at, what does nature look like? We go out to the forest, we don't just see cedar trees and then just fir trees and then just hemlock and just one like bunch of birch, and like, not the birch grows much here, but I mean maples and alders, they don't just grow in one spot, they're spread out. And that's a healthier forest when you have a mix of deciduous and coniferous trees. On the subject of coniferous trees, if you're going to grow yew trees, know that you're going to wait a long, long time for them to even get up to your hips. They're going to take decades to even get up to your hip level. So if you are looking for that, again, that's it's a good idea to think about planning your what I like to call the Indigenous food forest. And a lot of people understand that, because more and more people are getting into that. And don't just have a little stack of berries in your yard. Think about how if you have a yard, or if you have a community garden or a space where you can put that effort in with a group of people, it is well worth it, and it will pay off in the long run. And another great deciduous tree is elders, red elders and the blue elderberries. So those ones are going to be the ones that also help support these bigger trees by creating a shade zone, especially in near the root system. So again, you wouldn't want to put them like an arm length away or anything to a cedar. You'd want to actually put them about 10 to 20 feet away, just depending on what your space is. If it's a small space, maybe 5 to 10 feet, but know that as that cedar gets bigger, it will eventually create the shade canopy years to come, years ahead. So really, do some research and planning, and if you're just gonna live in a small like building, maybe you're doing a rooftop garden, but you want to have some coniferous trees and deciduous trees, that's good too. But know that at a certain point, you'll have to remove them because they won't last for decades ahead in these pots. They will eventually need to be transplanted into a more solid ground. So not to discourage people, but to encourage you to do that, and also think of the short and long-term planning of how and where you're growing your indigenous plants, trees, and shrubs.
Awesome, thank you, Cease. Christine posed a question about any opinions on the planting of sequoia, that's the California redwood here. And having just sold one today to somebody from our nursery, I can say that I was talking about this. And I don't know so much about, in the case of the ones that were propagated here by one of our board members, his were taken from cuttings, and both he and the fellow who bought the tree, who's also tried growing from seed and from cuttings, were mentioning that the germination rate is very low from the sequoia seed. So then in that way, we could extrapolate that it's not a big invasive threat. It's not going to be reseeding at a great rate and taking off if you were to plant one. And that's the limits of my understanding basically on it. But I do know there are trials being done on the island for growing them, just to see if these can become a companion, and to see about the extension of their range into BC as a viable tree here.
Yeah, and they've been transplanted up here for years and years. There's lots of sequoias. I actually recommend, if you're trying to learn a bit more about trees that aren't indigenous to here, my friend wrote a really great book called The Vancouver Tree Book. And he tells a little story about each tree, but that some of them are massive and quite old. And it tells the history of their growth and their trials and tribulations. And so, yeah, and sequoias was planted a lot in the 70s for sure. They're beautiful trees. I know Stanley Park has a number of them. I live near Stanley Park, and I've been discovering all the sequoias that are very close to me. And they have a lot of room to grow. Like Stanley Park, it's just to note that the entire peninsula is a garden. It's no longer an old growth forest. It's definitely not an ancient forest. It's a garden that has been essentially planted and transplanted several times by the settlers that work for the park board. And so I know this firsthand from having done work, lots of things in the park. And at the same time, it does have all the scars of the old growth and ancient forest, which are all the big cedar stumps throughout the forest. And again, they're the best kinds of gardens, are stumps and nurse logs, because they harbor a whole bunch of things. They harbor new seedlings of trees and huckleberries and salal and lichens and fungus. So all of that stuff is going on. And So really think about if you're clearing your land and you have some trees you want to get rid of, turn them into nurse logs. It's a really, again, like just like the leaves, it's a vitamin nutrient that you're offering to help support the plant life in your garden. I didn't actually talk about the Oxalis Oregano, but I notice a couple of people are looking at ground cover. So that's a good one. It's fluffy, it's pretty, it's a great pollinator. Wild strawberry is, and kinnikinnick. So you got to look at all areas. And another one that's extremely super easy to transplant and propagate on its own, I know Kirsten probably love this, is wild succulents, because literally you just take a handful and throw it, especially in the wet season, and they will just create their own blanket of a natural living mulch. And they grow with all kinds of plants. They really are so easy. And for people a little bit afraid of getting started, they will boost your ego a lot, because you'll be like, oh, it just grew so fast, it's so much, it didn't do anything. So any of you who are lazy gardeners, you'll love that one. It's a really good one to learn about stone crops and other succulents, and there's many indigenous varieties throughout there. Yeah, what's that? All the prop I've done for Coast Salish. Oh, I couldn't read it all. It disappeared. I can check it after. But yeah, I hope
succulents are so hip right now that we could probably have a whole program just on native succulents and introducing people to them and their beautiful flowers, and that would be fun to give them their own show even.
Yeah, and as Lena's saying, the plain oxalis, yes, is very invasive, but the redwood oxalis with pink leaves and pink flowers, much more delicate, nice companion for acidic plants. And they leave this fluffy cloud-like element and great living mulch. So, there's many ways you can add to your garden and make it more fun and pretty and low maintenance. Living mulch definitely takes a lot of the labor out, because it protects the roots and the ground cover that helps your plants stay moist and retain that moisture after a good rainstorm, even in the summer.
Lena's got another question that she posed earlier, and since we've touched on the sort of hot button or important issues of harvesting, as well as the extension or definition of native seed mixes, Lena's asking a question about what our thoughts are on planting varieties of native plants, as in sort of the cultivated varieties of the native plants, and what some of the issues might be around that. And that's probably a great one for us to finish off on, as we'll be close to 15 minutes over by that point.
Yeah, the one that she's referring to, the King Edward one, the one where they took some red flowering currant and brought them to Europe and then brought them back to sell to us here. Oh, why? Just not to disappoint you, but if you get that variety, you're never going to get berries, because it doesn't actually produce berries. So something happened in that propagation process, and it could have been traveling to sea and coming back, that changed that. But it doesn't. It'll produce great showy flowers, but they don't pollinate well. And there's a great, beautiful currant, delicious looking. I love that picture. It looks so luscious. So, if you want the berries, you're better off to get the ones that are not that variety that has been propagated in England, and get the local indigenous one that they're both indigenous, but that one's been altered somehow, that they might have done something to it in England, but it might have just been from the way it was propagated. It could have cut it off. And there's so many reasons why that happens. So I'm just going to, again, look back at the, see what else there was added. If any of you want to add into that, good. That would, if Kristen wants to say anything about that, that would be good to add now.
Yeah, I agree with Cease there. I stay away from cultivars. All garden plants are cultivars of what are native plants somewhere and have just are derived and derived and derived over time until they become something else. And so the King Edward variety or the Thunderbird variety are just transitions into being something that they're not. And why, if there's the kind of option to celebrate local biodiversity and we have the opportunity to do that, I just encourage us all to do that.
Well said. I agree. Cute. I can't do two thumbs because one hand's holding my iPad. But in heart, I have two thumbs up for you too. I just needed a different angle. I've been sitting in a weird angle all day and I don't want my neck and back to be like twisted. But yeah, it's just, it's all about genetics. And that's what happens with these plants is they, the cultivars, you want to try to get as close to the real thing and the real thing if you can. And that's where the advice we've given, like with the red ouzier and the local red flowering currant, like from bushes, that every year produce currants, like then you're not snipping off a cultivar. And look at that beautiful showy flower arrangement. And but be gentle when pruning, because I had a roommate a few years ago that hacked the heck out of his red currant. Crying inside. I'm like, don't let him near the garden. I know it's his garden, but don't let him near his garden.
Oh, Cease, you're holding your mic. Your hand's on your mic.
Sorry.
No
yeah,
worries.
so you just don't want to hack the heck out of something and make it so it doesn't come back the next year. So yeah, thanks, Nicole. You're amazing.
No worries, happens to me too.
Yeah, like, oh.
Awesome.
All right, well, I'm not gonna say anything more because I can talk even after a whole day of talking. So
She's on a roll. The Zumbi is live today. I will hold up, we had these two different seed packets that we were selling in addition to some of the other stuff that had been around earlier at the Maplewood Flats and the Native Plant Nursery. So we had a pollinator mix and the self-heal, and I wanted to bring these up in the presentation today because for both of them, for folks at the South Coast, we're recommending that based on the seeds that are here, that those go in the ground in the next couple of weeks. They want to be in the ground 2 to 4 weeks before the last frost, and which is now in the next couple of weeks, and that you can sow them, cover them with a thin layer of soil and keep them moist over these next weeks. It seems like with the weather being as it is, that's not going to be an issue. And Kristen has made some beautiful slides addressing the species that we have in the pollinator mix as well as the self-heal. And so we can end off with some beautiful inspiring images for your growing season. That's the self-heal there in the middle. And this is a plant that's in the mint family. And I learned today, it was new to me when we started sourcing the seed just before Christmas time, but I learned today that it's an ingredient in an ancient traditional Chinese tea, as well as I'm sure Cease can elaborate on some of the medicinal uses closer to home here, but that it finds its way into all kinds of things in the beverage that it's in this commercially produced drink called Jia Duo Bao. That's saying that it's based on a herbal tea mix from the Qing dynasty. So there's some neat, although we are considering that this is a plant that's native to here, of course, some of them are in fact circumpolar species or can be found in their various forms much farther afield.
Yeah, I definitely just really follow what the name says, and I've used it for healing. I've used it in salves, and yeah. Well, thank you, Christine. Thank you for your kind words. She's just telling me she's a fan, or I hope I've got your pronouns right. And yes, and I'm part Swiss, but mostly Indigenous bloodlines. And I always love to connect with Swiss folks and chat about the things that I do know about being Swiss. And I can say honestly that a lot of my plant love came from my father, who grew up in the Alps, and he had a very strong connection to plant medicines. And when he moved here, he was one of my influences in both traditional medicine use as well as gardening. My dad was an amazing gardener, and he really encouraged me and showed me the way. And I never thought I'd be as good a gardener as him. And I'm getting there. I'm working towards my lifelong master gardening goal. So, anyway,
Soon be able to call you an expert. You're already
one
in the
day.
expert.
One day.
Thanks to everyone for making it tonight and for sticking with us as we talk about plants, which we all love and can talk on and on about. Leanne's reminding me that we're meant to remind folks that Cease is going to be doing a monthly plant highlight that'll be on Saturdays, at third Saturday of the month, 10 in the morning. And those get recorded and are available in perpetuity on our website. As well, this third Thursday of the month is also going to be a set slot for a plant-related workshop of some description here online. So we'll look forward to seeing a bunch of you again as you're able to come. And feel free to follow us on whichever social media platform you're involved with, or get on the Wild Bird Trust email list to get the announcements about those events. And I should plug Kristen's amazing nursery over on the island also.
Yeah.
They have so exciting and a real wealth of information on their website also. Just that she gave you a little hint there of the instructions around planting out potted plants as well as sowing from seed. And she's also got lots of amazing guides for different ecotypes and different planting site considerations. And we're really glad that she could make it today. So thanks for being here with us, Kristen.
Thank you so much for the invite, and I sure hope we can do this together again sometime.
Super fun. I just want to quickly answer Lena's question. Yes, we actually do walks and talks, my daughter and I, not sometimes at the same time for special events at Maplewood Flats, but that was pre-COVID days. But we, both my daughter and I do plant walks, and I always say that she's taken it to the next level, because I'm very proud of the fact that she's learned our language and can talk about the plants in the language and break down a lot of the cultural stories that I've told over the years. It really connects those dots, why they're named what they are, and how we use them in different ways. So yeah, keep an eye on Maplewood Flats when there's more things to look at, and hopefully COVID protocols lighten up. Hopefully everybody's that can be vaccinated are getting vaccinated. And anything that we can all do to bring ourselves closer to what it was pre-COVID, then we can start doing walks like that. So keep an eye on Wild Bird Trust, Maplewood Flats, and the fabulous staff there that are like my big sheroes. They're all awesome. They'll be able to inform you about that.
Woohoo! Awesome. That was great, guys. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much to Kristen, to Erin, to Cease, and to all of you guys tuning in from home. So we hope you have an amazing night, and definitely stay tuned. We have events every Thursday evening at 7 and Saturday morning at 11 a.m. So follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and have a great night. Bye.
One last short plug for the nursery at Maplewood Flats for people who are still here, that we're looking toward Easter weekend to be our opening weekend for the nursery. So for anybody who wants to come and see us in person and a freshly stocked selection, that's what we're aiming for. And again, we'll make some announcements online for that.
Nice. All right, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
We can't wait to
everybody.
have you,
Bye, everyone.
Kristen.